Hi, this is Jennifer Rubin. I'm editor-in-chief of the Contrarian, and it is my delight to have with us a renowned historian, H.W. Brands. He is author of more than 30 books, multi-time Pulitzer Prize winning finalist. Welcome to our little show. Nice to have you, Professor.
Delighted to join you.
Let me start with tariffs. We had a bout with tariffs, as we are reminded by the current president, under President McKinley, and then again in the 20th century. Why do presidents resort to tariffs, and what's been our experience?
Tariffs were the principal way the federal government of the United States raised money in the 19th century. And it was because most people didn't have cash incomes. They were farmers. And so you couldn't tax their income. And besides that, the Constitution was interpreted to forbid income taxes. And so tariffs were an obvious way. Tariffs are simply a sales tax. They're a sales tax on imports. And they're easy to monitor and to collect because the federal government under our Constitution controls trade. And so goods have to be imported, at least legally imported goods come through, and they come through customs. And you can see what they are and you can value them and you can collect the tax. Just as a sales tax is relatively easy to collect because the money is changing hands and the government takes its 8% or whatever it takes. So the tariff was very tempting that way. It was tempting as a source of revenue. It was also tempting as a source of protection. For the term in those days was infant industries. The United States was slower off the mark to the Industrial Revolution than Britain, its principal commercial partner and rival. And so people like Henry Clay in the early 19th century said that American industry needs protection. Otherwise, we'll be flooded by British goods and American industry will never get off the ground. But, said Henry Clay, these should be limited in time. Give American industry a decade or two, and then it will be up to competition. We'll take them back. And so this provided the basis for an ongoing political debate in the United States from the 1810s to the 1930s, the last time before World War II that tariffs were widely employed. It was during the 1930s. And they always had their advocates and they always had their critics. And they would go up typically when the Republicans took control, and they would go down when the Democrats took control. The Republicans were the party of business, and business liked the protection for its businesses. The Democrats were more the party of consumers, and consumers don't like tariffs because they raise the cost of the stuff they have to buy. Now, the need for the tariff for revenue was greatly diminished after the approval of the 16th Amendment, which allowed a federal income tax. And almost immediately, the income tax on personal incomes, on corporate incomes, supplanted the tariff. And so the tariff was no longer necessary to raise revenue. But the tariff did stick around as a way of protecting, at least this was the idea, protecting American industry, for example, during the Great Depression. And so if consumers aren't buying much, the government thought, well, Congress thought, they ought to at least buy American. And we will make them buy American by making imports much more expensive. It was tried, and it was generally perceived to be a disastrous experiment because not only did American imports to the United States go down, other countries retaliated, world trade collapsed, and the Depression deepened and really kept its hold on much of the world economy for the decade until World War II. So American leaders took the lesson from this is don't get involved in tariff wars, don't use tariffs as a way of engaging in diplomacy. And American leaders, American presidents stayed away from tariffs until Donald Trump came along. And Donald Trump decides, okay, this is a good idea. I mean, he was essentially making the 19th century argument in the 21st century.
And of course, we have moved in the opposite direction. And in fact, this president renegotiated what was the NAFTA agreement to have a very integrated economy in North America. Has that integration benefited the United States, Canada, and Mexico, or is it hurt those economies by having a very integrated North American economy?
Well, this is one where when you say benefited the United States or Mexico or whatever, you have to be more specific. It certainly benefited certain groups. It benefited consumers in all of those three countries because they're getting the goods cheaper than they would have otherwise. Much of the produce that winds up on American tables comes from Mexico, and it comes in essentially duty-free. And so we eat better and cheaper than we would have had the old tariff regime been in existence. I'll add here that certainly economists think that the free trade regime that succeeded the tariff regime of the 1930s, the free trade regime from the 1940s to the beginning of the 21st century, has been an enormous success in elevating standards of living around the world. This is what lifted 1 billion people out of desperate poverty around the world. And it benefited American consumers. We get the goods for cheap. But there are always groups that have reason to complain about the tariffs, because the economists always say there's no such thing as a free lunch, and there's no such thing as free trade for everybody. Because if imports come in, then potentially they're replacing goods that might have been made in the United States. And the people who are making those goods, both the companies and the employees that they employ, they're going to lose out. And very often it's easier to identify those groups. So if you worked in the textile industry in North Carolina in the 1980s, and in the next 20 years, you saw textiles being manufactured in China coming in and undercutting the goods that you could make, well, you would, okay, I lost my job because of that. Consumers don't notice the benefit because the benefit is much more widely spread, and the benefit might be just sort of pennies per item. Now, if you add all this up, as economists are wont to do, if you add it up, then it's a net benefit. But the beneficiaries don't feel it as strongly as those who are losing out feel the loss.
Fair enough. Let me shift gears a little bit. We have had times when big business, the trusts of the 19th century, which were conglomerations of industries, big companies, had immense influence with the president. Have we had a situation in which either a single individual or a single industry had as much influence as we're seeing with Elon Musk and some of the so-called tech bros with the president, where he is almost seeming to subcontract out part of the presidency or policy making to these people?
We've never seen anything like Elon Musk. There has never been a moment when a president explicitly turned to somebody outside of government and said, you take this over. Now, presidents before Donald Trump were leery of treading on the Constitution. They liked to present the image that they took the Constitution seriously, and that they wanted to be seen as fair brokers among the various participants in the American economy. Now, Donald Trump certainly comes from a different background, and he seems to treat the presidency in much the way he treated his role as a business leader. And if you're in business and you're negotiating with somebody else on a business deal, it's not unusual for people to make sort of ridiculous first offers. But then, you dial that back down. And because you're merely a leader of a business, nobody is watching over his shoulder that much. Nobody is saying, boy, you sold us out. It's, this is the way you negotiate. I should say, this is the way Donald Trump negotiated. He seems to have brought that into the public sphere. And he seems to be pushing out on the boundaries of what was accepted in actions by presidents to see how far he can push. With Donald Trump, he's in a unique position in having, what shall I say, rendered his public statements so often contradictory that nobody knows what he's really trying to do. And so he can say something outrageous, and if it doesn't play well, he can say, I was just joking. And he's done it so often that it's not even news when he does this. Presidents before Donald Trump tried to portray an image of consistency. And if a president said something today that differed from what that president, maybe even as a candidate, said 6 months before, there would be much effort made to say, well, I really didn't change, and here's why. With Donald Trump, that doesn't apply. And this is a method, a mode that he has pioneered in the White House, and it works for his supporters. Now, those people who don't support him, they're sort of tearing their hair and say, he's getting away with this again. The question is, will it work for the country as a whole? And this is really critical. How does this play with foreigners? So foreigners who don't know, shouldn't be expected to know about Donald Trump's career as a reality TV host. Presidents in the past have acted, when their president spoke, you were supposed to take what they said seriously. And if Donald Trump decides, after all, not to try to re-annex the Panama Canal Zone, will the leaders of Panama be comforted by his saying, I was just kidding? And will Justin Trudeau take it as perfectly acceptable. If he says, well, no, I really never intended that Canada should be the 51st state. It's one thing if you do it to countries like Canada, a friend, Panama, weak. But if you do it to China, then, and if the Chinese conclude he's not kidding and take actions accordingly, well, China has nuclear weapons. So it's not out of the question that Trump's style could push the world closer to a conflict that maybe Donald Trump himself didn't even intend.
It seems that this is, whether intentional or not, we don't know how much of this is conscious on Donald Trump's part, that this is a repudiation of what we call the international world order that was set in place after World War II. International organizations, free trade, the United States is the defender of what we euphemistically call the West or the free world, and that people could depend upon the United States, our allies could depend, and frankly, our adversaries knew what we were up to. That benefited the United States. Do we know what the world will look like if that falls apart? Do we know what the consequences may be?
We certainly do not know. And this is a big risk to be taken. Now, it's worth noting that this idea of this international order always had to be sold to the American people. Because if you're just a person living in Kansas City, what do you care about what's going on in the middle of Eurasia or, in Africa or Southeast Asia? But presidents have considered it part of their job to educate the American people on exactly what the United States has been getting out of this international framework. It's easy for critics of this framework to point to all the money the United States spends on defense, spends twice as much on defense as its NATO allies. And therefore, they're free riding on this. Why doesn't Germany defend itself? And one of the things that the presidents took pains not to say, because they didn't want this really aired, was, well, one of the reasons the United States is paying to defend Germany is to prevent Germany from paying to defend itself, because the last couple of times that happened, we wound up in 2 world wars. And this is a common saying among people who study foreign policy, but the whole point of NATO was to keep Russia out, America in, and Germany down. And so if the Germans conclude that the United States is not a reliable ally, well, the Germans have the capacity to build an army. Japan certainly has capacity to build nuclear weapons. They could do it in 6 months. And do we Americans want to deal with the world, well, that we had to step into the middle of in the 1940s and set in this position we've had? One of the things that always happens in history is people tend to judge the present by the recent past. And the longer things go well, the higher the standard for the present. Because when Americans came out of World War I and World War II, they were close enough together. There are plenty of people who remembered both. There were some people who fought in both. And they thought that the settlement that the United States crafted and led in the 1950s and 1960s was way better than what happened in the 1910s and 1940s. And so if the United States paid a little bit more than its allies did, it paid a lot less than Americans did in money and in lives than they did in World War I and World War II. But you get 70 years out from World War II, and Americans start to think, well, World War II, that's old history. And so, we become spoiled. In fact, I think the simplest explanation for what happened to the post-war liberal order was it was a victim of its success. And people, okay, it's successful, good, give me more. In politics, what have you done for me lately? And this applies in foreign affairs, at least when viewed by citizens in a free political system. So what the Chinese think about the international order is kind of immaterial because they don't get to vote. But Americans do get to vote. And it's pretty easy to say for somebody like Donald Trump to come along saying, we've been ripped off by the Europeans, by the other members of NATO for years, and now we're going to demand more. So what will this lead to if this changes? Heaven only knows. I hope we don't find out.
Let me end on this. We tend to think that whatever period of time we are in goes on forever until it doesn't. We have been in periods of time like the Gilded Age, where there were great accumulations of wealth, great influence of business, but that was then followed by a progressive era in which the tables turned. What does it take to shift from one period to another? Is it a calamity? Is it a popular revulsion against corruption? What does it take to change the direction or the tune of American political and social life?
So in America, populism is sort of akin to millennialism. You know, you promise everything, elect me, and I will make everything right. Well, it's kind of like millennialism. If the end doesn't come, then you got to wake up the next day and sort of explain why it didn't. So there have been three sort of phases of American populism. The first was under Andrew Jackson in the 1820s and 1830s. The second one was under the Populist Party, as it's called, in the 1890s, and then today. And in each of the former cases, well, the millennium didn't arrive. And so the 1890s is a really good example. You alluded to this with the rise of progressivism. So the populists didn't get what they wanted. And there's an inherent reason why they don't, because populists, by their nature, they're preaching against the status quo. And if they get elected, then they become the status quo, and then they have the responsibility for delivering. And so I think the most likely outcome to the moment we're in is that Donald Trump, having led his supporters to believe that if he's elected, then all these good things will happen. Well, they won't. And at some point, his followers will say, okay, guess that didn't work. Now, will they turn against Donald Trump? I kind of doubt it, because they have a lot emotionally invested in Trump per se, but they won't eagerly sign up for some workaround of the 22nd Amendment to keep him in the presidency beyond 2029. I think they'll just kind of, and they won't raise their hand and say, I admit it, I was wrong. No, they'll just, quietly go away. Donald Trump didn't win by much this time around. So it doesn't take much defection or much disillusionment among his followers to flip the tables.
Well, as I like to say, I think we're in a race between the population becoming disenchanted and our constitutional system crumbling. So we hope the former happens before the latter. Yes. Thank you so much. It's such a delight to talk to you and to get some historical perspective. We hope to have you back again. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Good luck.